videos on. Let's do a check-in really quick. Thank you, Maria. I'm doing good too. It's honestly kind of halfway between like, life is pretty good, but wow, I have a lot going on. I don't know if y'all are feeling that too, but that's where I'm at today. So on a scale of 1, not doing very well, to 5, I'm doing amazing. How are you guys? You have 5, 8, 3, need some 3s, 2, 2.5, 4, a couple of 8s earlier, 1, 2. Yeah, so it kind of looks like the average is about 3, but we have people on all different ranges of that. I just want to remind you guys that we're living in crazy times. It's, and remember that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like we just had midterms week. A lot went on during midterms week. We have a crazy election in 2 weeks. We have a lot of different social events going on, everything. So just remember to take care of yourself and practice self-care. Send me an email if there's any way I can help. Yeah, let me get the lecture started. Oh yeah, so reminder also, we are going to have the optional paper proposal due next Wednesday at midnight. Okay, so the optional paper proposal is basically maximum half page. It's just a summary of what you might want to do an optional paper on. For grad students, you have a required paper, which is the first option. We have 2 different options for this paper. The first option is you take something you're really, really interested in and apply it to 2 class subjects. Okay, so that could be like self-regulation and attachment, right? Or self-regulation and parenting. The other option is watching a movie like The Breakfast Club or Boyhood. That's the other one I was thinking of. Watching some kind of movie and then relating it to 2 class subjects. So again, for grad students, your required paper is on the first option. Undergrads, you can choose one of the 2 to write an extra credit paper on. I highly, highly recommend turning in the extra credit optional proposal. Here's why. You have to turn in a proposal to be able to do the paper at the end of the semester. But if you turn in the proposal, it doesn't mean you have to do the paper. It just means you have the option to. All right, so it just means you have that option. You don't have to. So I highly recommend turning that in. We'll review it. The purpose is for us just to give you an idea like, hey, we think this is a good idea, go forward with it, or hey, change these things. It's just for us to give you some initial feedback. So we'll get that to you quickly after it's due. Okay, yes, next Wednesday at midnight. So we'll remind you again next week, but just a heads up that that's coming. Review some of the stuff from class. Think about what you might want to do that on. Any questions regarding the optional paper, required paper, or the proposal? Okay, cool. So let me get us started. Okay. Okay, so today we are talking about race and ethnicity and personality and social development. Since Shari and I are both doing lecture today, so we'll bounce back and forth between the 2 of us. So just to preface, race and ethnicity is a beautiful and amazing thing that's part of a lot of our lives, everyone's lives. It has to do with our culture, it has to do with our heritage, it has to do with who we are. And it's an amazing part of who we are. Unfortunately, it also has to do for a lot of people in our society with oppression and disproportionate oppression based on race and ethnicity. So we're going to talk about both of those today. And it's a really, really important thing to talk about. We see George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and COVID-19 disproportionately impacting communities of color. We see actions against Asian and Asian Americans because of COVID-19. So this is a very heavy subject. We have a lot going on right now too. And in an election where in both the town hall, both debates so far and in the future debate, race in America is also a topic that is being talked about. So this is a big topic right now, and there's a lot going on with it. We're all bringing different things to this lecture related to this topic too. So I want to start off with a video. This is that show, What Would You Do? I don't know, it's basically a bunch of psychology experiments. So let me know if the volume doesn't work for some reason or something like that.
Yeah, Bethany, I don't think there's any sound.
Okay. Let me try to figure out why. Do you think it might be because I'm wearing headphones?
I'm not sure. Sometimes you might have to share your computer sound on Zoom while you're sharing screen. I don't know if that might be a thing.
Yeah, let me look into my sound stuff really quick.
No, I'm not getting any sound yet.
Let's try one more, and then if this doesn't work, we'll do individual links. Okay. No? Okay, we're gonna do this a little different then.
You could turn on the closed
I'm
captioning.
gonna turn on the closed captioning. That could work. Okay. Thank you, Jacob. Let's go with that. Okay. So yes, the video was a bit flawed. The captioning was a bit flawed, but essentially a lot of the conversation revolved around this idea that this individual they set up trying to wear similar things, similar builds, try to make the individual similar age, and have them stealing a bike. And if somebody asked, they needed to admit, yes, I'm trying to steal this bike. No, it's not my bike. To see what happened. And you see in the case of the young white man, people kind of walked by. They said, maybe I'll call the police later. In the case of the young black man, you see people immediately confronting him, calling the police, taking photos, taking his stuff. In the case of the young white woman, people offered help.
Professor?
And eventually someone, yeah?
Your audio is like crackling.
It's crackling. Let me see. Pretty choppy. Okay. Let me try a few things. Is that any better?
Can you say some more words?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm hoping this is better. I tried turning off a few things. Worse. Oh no. Oh, okay. Let me try turning off my video. That might help.
Or if you turn down your microphone volume, maybe.
Does that help?
No, I was wrong.
Let me try a different microphone.
Oh, that worked.
Okay, cool. I just had to switch the microphone really quick. Okay, a few bumps in the road today. All right, so we have this video. The audio was a little bit off, or the captioning was a little bit off, but essentially you see they have a character about the same age, height. They have him wear similar clothing, and in the case of the young white man, people kind of see what he's doing and say, oh, I'll call the police later, or just kind of go by. In the case of the young black man, you see people immediately confronting him, taking photos, stealing his stuff, yelling at him. And then in the case of the young white girl, people helping and people asking her about it and not being sure if a girl would steal a car or steal a bike, and what those differences would look like. So here they tried to equalize everything across the experiment except race and sex, essentially. And you see these differences, and there's a lot more on this. What would you do? Psychology experiments, a lot of different stuff that shows consistent evidence like this. So let's back up a little bit. I want to go through some terms, all right? So these are what I call nested terms, where social categorization is this really broad category, and then each of these is under that window. So you have social categorization, within that is stereotypes, within that is prejudice, and within that is discrimination. So let's start with social categorization. Social categorization is an awareness of social categories that divide people into groups. It's a universal process, happens everywhere, that organizes our world and imposes structure in our world. So this is something that we naturally do from the start of life onward. One thing that's important to know about social categorization, it's neither negative nor positive. It's simply sorting people, dividing people into categories. All right, there's no traits assigned at this point. So this happens everywhere. It's how we organize our world. It can be by demographic factors like sex, like race, ethnicity. It can be by personality or interests. In the cliche high school stuff they talked about in the 2000s, you know, there's jocks and nerds in these different groups. This can also be by occupation, firefighters, teachers. You talk to a lot of really young kids, you know, and they're like, oh, firefighters, you know, they just categorize people this way because they're really excited usually about firefighters or different things like that. It kind of fits into some of Plato's theory about how we categorize items too. But I want to talk about it in terms of a second grade classroom with reading groups. So usually in elementary school, you get assigned to a reading group depending on your reading level, so that kids who are a little farther along can be with peers in a similar, they're farther along. And then maybe some of the kids who are struggling can be in the same group and work together. So you might have like a blue group that's maybe people well advanced past second grade reading, maybe they're in third or fourth. You have people who are above average in class, maybe people who are like average or a little bit below, and then maybe people who are far behind in their reading. So social categorization is just kids recognizing we have different groups. There are some people in the blue group, some people in the green group, some people in the red group. Underneath that, and again, note there's no trait assignment. It's just organizing people into different groups. Underneath that, we have within social categorization, we have stereotypes. Stereotypes can be positive or negative. All right, now we get to traits. Traits assigned to individuals based solely on group membership without consideration of other factors. I want to draw your eye to two important words. First, traits. Traits are a distinguishing quality or characteristic that really refer to people's nature, that refer to your personal nature. So a trait is an aspect of a person's nature. The other important word there is solely, only. This is the only thing that's in consideration. So it's personal aspects of a person's personal nature assigned to them solely based on group membership without considering other factors. A stereotype tends to be a thought about a group, a person who is a part of a group. So it's a thought. The key is that, again, this can be positive or negative. So say you're a second grader in the green group and you notice, hey, a lot of people in my group are really good readers. And then you visit another classroom. You don't know anything about their structure. You don't know anything about what the different colors mean. And someone tells you they're in a green group in their classroom. And you may think, oh, they must be a good reader, right? Because this is what you know from your experience and you're assigning it without knowing anything about their classroom to them. Underneath that window, then you get to prejudice, all right? Prejudice is always negative. It is never positive. Prejudice is always negative. It's a negative evaluation of an individual because they belong to a specific group. Maggie, absolutely. Sometimes we see something that might be positive that feels negative too. It depends on the individual. So I could say something stereotypical that I think is positive that comes across negative. There's also positive stereotyping as far as, so when I was young, my mom told me, if I get lost in the grocery store, find a mother with children to help me. Don't find a man who's alone, don't find a woman who's alone, or anyone who's alone. Specifically find a woman with children. And so that's kind of a positive stereotype or thought, that if I find a woman with children, she will be protective of children and she will help me find my mom again. And so that's kind of a positive stereotype of this person where it doesn't really come with any negative connotations. So there are some positive stereotypes that we have in our society that don't have any negative connotation.
Can I ask a question about?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it in theory be prejudice if, like, for example, you see a man with, two kids who are like obviously his children. I mean, obviously, like, it is more likely that a man will like kidnap a child or something like that. But would that not be like prejudice against, a dad?
Well, it depends on the context, I think. It's definitely in some ways, like if I had a man with his kids come up to me, if I'm a little kid lost and I run away from him, in some ways that's definitely prejudice. And prejudice is a part of stereotypes, remember? There's this broader area of stereotypes though, where assigning it to the female, yes, in some ways it does reinforce sexism and the idea that all women are good. But I think in some ways it shows that I'm not putting anything negative on her necessarily. You know what I mean? I'm saying positive, like she's safe. Okay. But yeah, in some ways it is still reinforcing negative stereotypes. You guys are right. Absolutely. It's a really messy thing. Here's an interesting question. Can anyone think of a positive stereotype?
I mean, I think, okay, so, disclaimer, I'm going to be speaking about a group I do not belong to. So some people say, oh, Asian Americans are, thought of as being more academically proficient or, smarter or whatever, and saying, oh, that's a good thing. That means there's no racism against Asian Americans. But like, that's super not true. And there's this whole like model minority myth that, that I've heard of people saying like, actually that is sort of a form of racism. Again, talking about a group I don't belong to. So if anyone who is Asian American like wants to speak on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for speaking and sharing. I think that, yeah, that definitely comes with negatives too. Expectations for Asian Americans and Asian students to perform, and then wondering why they don't in those situations too. So yeah, well, maybe we need to amend this to say stereotypes, even when they're positive, are also negative. Like they're never fully one or the other. How does that sound?
Yeah, they
I
always
think.
say like never make assumptions. Any assumption you make is
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
backfires.
Yeah, and really it's always putting people in a box. It's true in some way. It's always putting people somebody said that in the chat, but yeah, absolutely. Yes, Amir, stereotype automatically erases individual variability and from that perspective cannot be respectful of people's dignity. Yeah, absolutely. So let's definitely amend that to stereotypes negative, even in the face when they seem positive or something, they're also negative. Yeah. Speak up, comment. I love these dialogues. So yeah, definitely feel free to keep commenting and asking questions, everybody.
Well,
And then,
speaking of something seeming positive but actually being negative, in one of my other classes, it's looking at psychology and law, and it's looking at sexism in the workplace towards women. And there's two kinds of sexism. There's like hostile sexism, like women are inferior and they're weaker beings and all this other stuff, and it's more outright. But then there's also what's called benevolent sexism, which is women are fragile creatures. Women must be protected at all costs, putting women on a pedestal, thinking that we're ethereal and can do no wrong and everything, and sort of taking away our humanity a little bit. And it's shown that benevolent sexism is endorsed like almost as much by women as it is by men, but it's just as negatively impactful as hostile sexism. And women that are exposed to benevolent sexism, like in the workplace, tend to underperform because it's still sexism, even if it seems nice, like, oh yeah, I want to be seen as a dainty little creature or whatever. It's really not. It's patronizing, and it's really actually an issue.
mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And those ideas. Definitely, definitely in basketball, I got both of those and it was super annoying. So yeah, but yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Natalie. For sure. Victim abuse at the hands of women. Yeah, not be taken seriously. Absolutely. Yeah, very good points. Awesome. Any other comments or questions about stereotypes before we move on to prejudice? Okay, we got a class recommendation, Psychology 207. Yeah, chivalry often underpins and maintains system of patriarchy. Yeah, got a lot of good stuff from the chat. Thank you. I should make sure everybody keeps it open. Okay. So prejudice, again, always negative. Is always negative. These tend to be feelings, attitudes, and opinions not based in reason or experience. All right, so feelings, attitudes, and opinions. Again, only based on group membership. So this is like the second grader visiting that other class and hearing, oh, someone in this reading group might be good, and then saying, oh, someone in the yellow reading group in this other classroom where they don't know the context might say, I don't think they're very smart, or I don't think they're a very good reader, right? So that's prejudice. And then under that, we get discrimination, which is unjust treatment of different categories of people. And again, always negative, right? These are behaviors, usually a combination of stereotypes and prejudice in action. So this is like refusing to play with people because they're a member of a certain reading group in those second grade classrooms or on the playground.
All right, so based on that, the next thing, also switching it up, if you're suddenly like surprised it's me. So with social categorization, everything that we talked about, we see that developing very early on, right? So infants begin categorizing people or things or situations pretty early. There's studies to show, this is also a class recommendation, even though I don't know if she's still doing that class, but Renee Balargian, she does a class on infant cognition. And she talks about these studies where infants were, I think, shown pictures of people from different races and different ethnicities, and they could tell very early on that the infants could differentiate between different ethnicities. So social categorization, it happens to start very early on. It's not something that is kind of learned. It's sort of your mind, your cognitive processes kind of work on that very early. And so these categories, you are looking at things, you're learning about the differences between these things, and you're learning how to make these differentiations, right? And like Bethany talked about, they're very rigid. These categories are not like fluid things. And especially for children, it's difficult for them to think about it in a fluid sense. So it's very rigid and they kind of follow that. The problem arises when that leads into psychological essentialism, which one of you even mentioned in the chat while the conversation was happening, is that from that categorization, we're moving into the stage of stereotypes, prejudice, and then discrimination, right? So once you start learning about these categories, you start attributing certain underlying traits to them. Like, again, so girls as caring, right? Or girls as being always dainty and correct and, you know, on some sort of pedestal and all that. That's a very sort of essentialistic thinking, because you know that girls versus boys, even though again, that's leaving out a lot of genders, but that differentiation that is made in our brains, sometimes we end up also attributing certain qualities to those different categories. Obviously, this leads to development of stereotypes and prejudice, and it can be a result of socialization. It's obviously a lot of different things happening at the same time. You also have context to thank for a lot of this. Media is a big part of it, and in terms of gender in specific, we're going to talk about that in a later class, but socialization from parents definitely is one of the factors which can lead to this sort of psychological essentialism happening. And yeah, like Paul said, we're always trying to create boxes so that it's easier for us to function in the world.
I have a quick question actually on the psychological essentialism. Sorry.
Go ahead.
So like when Googling it, it says that it's the view that certain categories have an underlying reality or true nature that one cannot observe directly. When it's saying one cannot observe directly, is it talking about the fact that like these boxes that we label people with can't be seen, or what do you think it means by that part?
I think it's just the fact that it's not always tangible things, right? So the fact that, you know, girls are caring is like for some girls, you might be able to see that, you know, with if I've seen a lot of my female friends with kids, some of them are caring, some of them are not. So it's sort of very intangible. You can't really see somebody being a female and be like, oh yeah, this person is going to be really good with kids and caring and have a motherly attitude. So I think that's kind of what they're trying to talk about there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? All right.
Okay, there's a bunch of little red circles for this, so I want to make sure I get all of them. Okay, so comment in the chat, have you heard of the Clark and Clark study of 1947 before? We got a mix, some yes, some no. Yeah, okay, so this is a very, very famous study that occurred in 1947, so about 7 years-ish before the Civil Rights Movement. And so what these two researchers did was they had Black children come in and choose between a white doll and a black doll. And so first they asked them, who do you want to play with the kids? And they had the kids answer. Then they asked them questions like, which doll is the nice doll? Which doll looks bad? Which doll is a nice color? And so what they found was they looked across ages. So this is the number of kids and the percentage for each age. This is 3 years old. This is 4 years old, 5, 6, and 7. So they looked from 3 to 7 years old. And the findings really shocked the world. So what they found was that when they asked Black children which doll they wanted to play with, a majority said the white doll across the ages. And it was most salient at 4 and 5 years old. Please note also that some of the percentages don't add up to 100% because some kids did not choose between the two dolls in the questions or in which they wanted to play with. So that's why they don't all add up to 100. They asked which is the nice doll. A majority said the white doll. And when they asked which doll looks bad, the black doll, they said a majority said the black doll looks bad. And then if they asked which one's a nice color, most said the white doll. So these findings were really hurtful and really scary and seeing, wow, these are how Black children are feeling in this context. And so generally they concluded the rejection of the brown doll and the preference for the white doll when explained at all were explained in rather simple and concrete terms. So when they asked the kids, why do you prefer the white doll? They said, because he's pretty, because he's white. And they talked about rejection of the brown doll, because he's ugly, because he doesn't look pretty, because in Black. They had these kind of explanations. And then they finished up the study by asking which doll looks most like you. And so what they found was that some of the children broke down and cried. Some became negativistic when they had to make those self-identifications. And 2 children actually ran out of the testing room and were crying. So the study was really groundbreaking. And we are going to look at, somebody asked about, has this been replicated recently? So this, when President Obama became president, ABC replicated this experiment. So we're going to try this one a little bit different. I'm going to put the link in the chat. Let's try this one this way, where, okay. Let me see how long that video is. So it's 5.5 minutes long. So why not, let's plan on getting back together at 3:45. So go ahead, pause this, or go watch that video really quick, and then we'll come back together. Guys, I feel you on this one. This video is heartbreaking. It's hard to watch. And I think it brings up issues like self-esteem, different things like that. I did forget to say in the original study too, when students were asked which doll looked like them, they also found that 44% of kids said the white doll looked like them. And then the findings were among kids who identified with the black doll. But yeah, we still see the effects of this. We still see that there's disparities in this. I looked up really quick an article published in 2017 that looked again at this study, and it found similar lines of results. They found that more kids identified with the black doll and wanted to play with the black doll, but some of the other stuff was still there as far as saying, this doll might misbehave more, this doll may not. So it's definitely a heartbreaking study. And yeah, Paul, I think that's a great point. It highlights the intersection of Eurocentric beauty standards, white supremacy, and colorism among numerous other insidious systems, right? So we see that these effects are still happening and that these are longitudinal. We're talking about 60, 70 years ago to today. So I want to talk really quick about the development. Any questions about the video, any comments, anything like that before we move on?
Yeah. So I noticed that the children who they asked were like, I mean, I'm not great at estimating age, but they were like older than the age that most children play with baby dolls. Like, I don't know, like I feel like I probably wasn't playing with baby dolls when I was like 11 or 12 or 10
Mhm.
or whatever they were. So, why did they not use younger children who actually were the age group that would play with baby dolls?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. A lot of them to me looked like elementary school. My guess was like 7 or 8, which is the older kind of age they had in the original study. I definitely didn't see anyone who looked like a 3 to 4-year-old to me. So I would have to look up what age group they used. And yeah, oh, they were around second grade. Okay, second grade is 7 to 8 years old. Okay.
Yeah, and
So,
yeah,
mhm,
also they did ask boys and like again, stereotype.
mhm.
Maybe statistically speaking, less likely to play with baby dolls. I don't know.
Well, I think in the original study, they actually had boys come in too.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So they had both boys and girls come in. Mhm. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Okay. So development of prejudice. So there have been a lot of different theories then. Okay, so how does this develop? How did this prejudice develop? So some people said it's cognitive, the cognitive developmental approach. They said basically early in life, like 7 to 8 years old, we have these cognitive limitations and they lead children to show bias or in-group preferences. All right, and S and Shari was saying, in Renee's class, we learned about babies as young as 3 months old prefer the faces of individuals who are the same race as their parents. And so we even see in very, very young children, it's been replicated at 3, 6, and 9 months old, that babies prefer these faces. So maybe it has to do with that. And then when we get a little bit older, like middle childhood, these biases become less likely because kids develop cognitive flexibility, right? So they use multiple categories to define an individual. So they're basically saying, our cognitive development makes social categorization really rigid in one category when you're younger, and it becomes multiple categories when you're older. So in this example, like a girl and brave. Okay, so maybe it's prejudice develops in young kids and then gets better as we grow. Then the social cognitive approach came on, like, wait a second. Prejudice continues into adulthood. It's not just that we see these things in young children, right? So yeah, we see this all the time as we prepare for Thanksgiving meals this year. I think some of us have those relatives who are adults and have to have those conversations with, right? But yeah, they said that there's facts about how racial outgroup attitudes remain stable or become more negative with age, and ethnic prejudice based on nationality actually increases with age. So we see that the prejudice doesn't really develop in younger children or come out there. It's present in adulthood. So we need more perspectives on this. One that doesn't just look at the cognitive piece. Perhaps how we socialize our kids and the social piece are really, really important here. Okay, so this led to the domain general developmental intergroup theory. That's a lot of words for a theory, but it has 4 stages. And so instead of saying it's related to a specific age, perhaps this is just how it develops over time. So it goes first with establishment. The establishment of psychological salience of individual attributes. Salience is prominence. So identifying individual attributes, right? Establishing those. Then we categorize individuals who reflect these attributes. So then there's a categorization. Yeah, I'll go back, Alejandra, absolutely. Then we have categorizing people based on those attributes, right? So that's the social categorization. Then we develop stereotyping. Then we assign attributes to everyone in these categories, right? And then we apply that stereotype. Then we make assumptions about people based on that stereotype. So this theory, again, is not age related. It's saying, we identify an attribute, we categorize individuals who reflect that attribute, and then we start to develop stereotyping and apply that stereotyping. The take-home message across those 3 different theories, there's a lot of theories about how stereotyping and prejudice develop. It's likely not a unidimensional thing. It's not just one thing, that prejudice is not one thing, and how we develop it is not one thing. It's multidimensional. It's complex. There are multiple pieces to this puzzle. And it's probably not only related to age. Yes, we experience cognitive development, but there's many different things going on here, like social development and socialization, which we'll go into in a little bit. And then our biases, both explicit and implicit, it's been found that they're influenced by interethnic contact and the status of different social groups within a given culture. So our biases are influenced by having interethnic friendships, contacts, people in our spheres of social world, and then the status of different social groups within our culture. That can be the culture of University of Illinois, the culture of Champaign, the culture of Illinois, and the culture of the United States broadly. So I'm going to go back really quick. Okay, I'll give you a little more time on this one too. Okay. So in other words, context and contact matter. All right, so for all of this. Okay, so we're going to go into Hughes' theory from 2006 about ethnic racial socialization. So this is parents. There's racial socialization and then there's ethnic socialization. Racial socialization reflects how parents of all races, but particularly ethnic minority parents, maintain their children's self-esteem and prepare them to understand and deal with racial barriers. Okay, so this is balancing. Can people see the slides right now? Somebody comment in the chat for me. Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, so racial socialization reflects how parents, particularly ethnic minority parents, maintain children's self-esteem and prepare them to understand and deal with racial barriers. So comment in the chat for me, who has seen the book or the movie The Hate U Give? Okay, a mix. I would highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. It's an amazing story about a young Black girl who grows up in a predominantly Black neighborhood that's also underprivileged, but she attends a white privileged private school. And so it talks about her dealing with her different identities in that context. And it goes into a little bit of her racial and ethnic socialization. So one of the things the movie opens up with, I would highly recommend both. If you haven't read it, seen the movie, it's amazing. What it talks about in the book is it opens up, I'll go back, Paul, in a second, yeah. It opens up showing the main character Star's house. And she has many indicators and many things in the house full of Black wisdom, Black history, and Black culture. They have a picture of Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party 10-point program, Black Jesus, and a lot of different Black historical people on the walls. And then the movie shows them getting the talk when they were younger. Essentially, it shows their father talking with Star, the main character, and her two brothers about what to do when a policeman pulls you over, and saying, preparing them for the fact that you are more likely to get pulled over as a Black individual driving a car. When you're pulled over, this is what you do. And he gives them steps to do that. This becomes relevant in the movie because very quickly in the movie, when you fast forward to her being a 16-year-old, she gets pulled over with a friend. And unfortunately, her friend is shot and killed by policemen because they think he has a gun when he has a hairbrush. And so the book is about the fallout from that and her being the witness of this case. But you have this contrast in the movie of showing that Black culture, Black history, with also having to have this conversation and the preparation for bias that they're experiencing. So preparing and dealing with racial barriers. So it's an example of her father maintaining children's self-esteem and sharing that with them, but also preparing them to understand and deal with those barriers. And then you also have ethnic socialization, which goes into a little bit what I was talking about in that example. It reflects the aspects of children's cultural retention, identity achievement, and in-group affiliation as they co-occur with efforts to assimilate into dominant culture. So this is happening at the same time. You learn about your culture, identity achievement. We're going to talk more about racial and ethnic identity development next week when I go into identity development and in-group affiliation. And this is happening at the same time as trying to assimilate into the dominant culture. A lot of the hate you give goes back and forth between Star living in this neighborhood and then also going to this school that's very, very different in a very different context, and what that means for her identity development, for how she expresses her culture, and what it's like to assimilate into a dominant culture that is very, very different from the culture you grew up in. So we have racial socialization and ethnic socialization. Ethnic socialization and both of these really get it. If you know W.E.B. Du Bois' work on double consciousness, the idea that we have one mind that represents our culture and what we grew up with, and then another mind that assimilates to dominant culture. I would highly recommend W.E.B. Du Bois too. So what that says there that I accidentally covered up is this represents parents' efforts to transmit to children information about race and ethnicity. So what does this look like? What are some of the practices that this looks like? First, this can look like cultural socialization. So these are parental practices to teach children about their history, their heritage, pride, explicitly and implicitly. Explicitly in ways of sharing, of going to cultural events. My grandmother had my mom and her siblings learn German songs in German because my mother was German, and learned those. And just learning those types of things. There's also preparation for bias. This reflects parents' efforts to promote awareness of discrimination and help prepare students to cope with it. So minorities groups face discrimination, and this helps prepare them for that. So that's like the scene I described in The Hate U Give, saying, hey, this is what I'm trying to prepare you so you're in this context, what to expect. There's also promotion of mistrust. This is parents' practices to highlight the need for wariness or distrust of like out-group or other racial ethnic interactions, and it encourages vigilance. This definitely happens on both sides. The idea of promoting mistrust, this can also happen explicitly and implicitly. So this is explicit conversations about don't trust this person or don't walk near this person, but this is also our implicit actions. Parents can also do this with white women tend to clutch their purse when a person of color walks by in a grocery store and their children see that. That's an implicit way that might happen. Or crossing the street when you see someone walking down the street. These implicit ways also promote mistrust. And then there's also egalitarianism and silence about race, which is basically parents encouraging their kids to value the individual qualities of a person over their racial group membership, or to avoid mentioning race and avoid talking about, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about color blindness. So families can do any range of these things. This is present in all families. Some families do none of these things. Some families focus on one, some focus on a few, and some families do all of these things. You really see a range. I think that might be a good place for a break. It's 4 o'clock. So let's take 10 minutes, come back together at 4:10. Yeah, see you guys.
All right. So now we're going to continue. So now that we sort of went through those different terms and what all of that means for ethnic racial socialization, what we're going to look at next are the different predictors of ethnic racial socialization. And the first one we're going to start with is child age and gender. There is the preparation for bias and promotion of mistrust that we just talked about, and that increases with age. Studies have also shown that cultural socialization might increase with age as well. So it's, you know, if you think about it in terms of when parents might start having these sort of conversations with their children, it makes sense that as children grow older, the kind of conversations the parents can have with their children about preparation of bias, promotion of mistrust, etc., can be deeper and may be easier to have than with children who are a lot younger, right? So child age definitely plays a role there. Even with cultural socialization, just because of the depth with which these conversations can be had as you grow older, it's easier to be able to talk about that kind of thing, like ethnic pride, cultural pride, things like that, as children are growing older. There's also studies which show that boys are more likely to receive messages about racial barriers, while girls might be more likely to receive messages about racial pride, right? So if we think about it in terms of, you know, the recent everything with the Black Lives Matter movements, and we've been, you know, seeing a lot of interviews or stories of where parents are talking about how they have to prepare their sons, right? Because it's so dangerous and deadly in so many cases where Black men are targeted in so many different ways, that yes, these messages about racial barriers and the ways in which they need to stay safe is a conversation that parents unfortunately have to have with them. These are conversations obviously that are also needed with girls too, but it was also seen that for girls, messages about racial pride were more common. So if we think about in the same vein, there's a lot of sort of social media conversations, or even within popular media, about Black girl magic, right? And I saw when you all were having the conversation about classes, I think there's an English class or something about Black girl magic in contemporary literature. So that's really cool. But that's the idea of having that is about racial pride is something that Black women are taking up and sort of re-identifying themselves with that pride that they feel as Black women. There's also the fact that use of ethnic racial socialization strategies can be a function of really some sort of complicated interaction between gender and context. So based on the context that you are in and the gender that you are, the way in which you're going to use these different strategies of ethnic racial socialization will differ, right? So, because like I said, the fact that boys will receive more messages of racial barriers and girls will receive more messages of racial pride we've seen that in studies, but then it's not mutually exclusive. Boys will also be receiving messages of racial pride, while girls will receive messages of racial barriers as well. So it depends on the context and the situation you're in for there to be, you know, for maybe for parents to have those different conversations with their children. The next predictor that we're looking at here is parental immigrant status and SES, so that's socioeconomic status. So recent immigrants were found to be more likely to use cultural socialization strategies and discuss discrimination with their children, while it was found that families which were higher SES associated with more cultural socialization and preparation for bias, right? So again, if I think about it in terms of, I can think about my relatives who are here in the US and the kind of conversations I've heard them having with their children. And they're recent immigrants, right? They were in India, now they're living in the US, and their children were born in the US. So for them, it is very important to have those conversations about cultural socialization and how the children are going to identify themselves with their culture, with their ethnicity, particularly while they're living in the US now. So that is something that does happen. And within those conversations, there is obviously that conversation about discrimination too, because they're not the majority. And so there's always going to be some sort of caution that's taught to such children at a very young age as well. For higher SES families, more cultural socialization and preparation for bias, you can think about it in terms of just parents know that the kind of situations that they've been through, the kind of prejudice or discrimination they might have faced, they want to make sure that their children know about it. In some cases, if they're higher SES families, it's possible that they will be entering into work spheres or even attending schools where they are already in a minority, and also just where they're underrepresented in some way or the other. And so being prepared for that bias makes it easier for those children to deal with it once, if and when they face it. So that could be another reason for that. The next predictor is region and neighborhood, right? So there is some evidence that there's greater preparation for bias in more integrated neighborhoods. Again, if you think about this in terms of, if you grow up in a neighborhood which is very integrated, there's a mix of several different ethnicities living in that same neighborhood. There is, you could say that it's a more diverse neighborhood, which is great, but then there is also a higher chance that you are going to face some sort of stereotypes, prejudice, bias within that neighborhood because there's people from other ethnicities. And so if you're in a more integrated neighborhood, you do have, parents feel that the children have to be more prepared to face that kind of bias. And so that becomes one of the reasons why they would go through the process of ethnic racial socialization more with their children. Just checking the chat. Yeah, Amr, when I first saw this, I was also, it was interesting to me that higher SES is related to that, but I think those are the reasons that I kind of thought of for that. Whoops. The next one is parental racial identity. So this also, if you think about it, makes sense that how strongly parents relate to their own racial identity, their own ethnic identity, the more likely they might be to promote a certain sort of ethnic racial socialization with their children as well. Because if parents have grown up in a situation where they were very strongly socialized with their ethnic and racial identity, they're going to want to pass it down to their children. But then if the parents themselves grew up in a situation where they may not have gone through that process as much, they may not feel that it is as important to pass on to their children again. So how strongly parents identify with their own ethnic racial identity will make a difference in how they pass that on to their children. The next one is parent and youth discrimination experience, which again is kind of self-explanatory. If parents or their children have faced discrimination in the current situation, right? So there's a child who goes to school and is bullied because of their race or their ethnicity, and they come back home and talk about it with their parents. Parents realize that this is now a conversation that they need to be having. And they realize that at this point, if they haven't been talking about some sort of cultural socialization, they haven't been, maybe there has been no preparation of bias for that child, they will start doing that now, because now they know that this discrimination has happened. They know that this is something, this experience is something that is now embedded in their mind. And so this is something they have to talk about. Oh, I love that. So Jacob just put in that there's a great podcast called Therapy for Black Girls by a psychologist in Georgia named Dr. Joy Harden. I love podcasts. I will try and listen to that. Okay. Any questions about predictors? All right. So consequences of ethnic socialization. What exactly, why are we even talking about it, right? The point is that cultural socialization has this association with a stronger identity, a stronger ethnic identity. And then this also leads to fewer externalizing behaviors that have been seen through research. Like there's less violence, lower fighting frequency, you have better anger management, you have higher self-esteem, better cognitive outcomes. There's a lot of different positive associations that have been seen for children who have gone through the process of racial ethnic socialization. So findings are mixed and inconclusive for what are the associations with preparation for bias and egalitarianism. So that's more, we don't have that much of a significant findings for those, but cultural socialization by itself has shown a lot of different positive outcomes when it has been done with children. So now what we're going to take a look at, so now that we know all of this, how is it manifesting, right? So let's try and see if this works. Let me know if you all can hear it, and if not, we shall do it some other way.
We're debuting a really important 360 special report called Kids on Race, The Hidden Picture. It's a project over a year in the making. Now, race relations, one of the most explosive issues in this country, and for many adults, the most taboo to talk about with kids. But what a lot of adults don't realize is that kids, even as young as 6 years old, are already talking about or thinking about race.
Sorry, I don't think we can see the video.
Friends with kids of other races is hard, and
we can hear it, we just can't see the video.
We're going to change the 1 second.
Yes, John, it's the opposite problem we were having earlier.
Isn't that always fun? Something or the other. Okay. Everybody can see it now, right? Okay.
Grow up. We teamed up with renowned child psychologist Dr. Melanie Killen to scientifically measure children's attitudes on race. Take a look at this. Dr. Killen and her team showed 6-year-old children this picture and asked them questions like, what's happening here? Are these children friends? And would their parents want them to be friends? The picture is designed to be ambiguous. What's happening is in the eye of the beholder. Then they showed them this picture and asked the same question. Now, the only difference in the pictures, the race of the children was flipped. Both white and African-American children were tested, and in addition to the 6-year-olds, the psychologist showed a similar set of pictures to 13-year-olds. At our request, they also asked kids open-ended questions about race to try to understand how it plays into their own lives. The responses were raw. Some of the experiences they described were frankly shocking. This is the reality of what kids see, hear, and think about race. Listen.
If you have the same skin, you can play together, but if you don't have the same skin, you can't play together.
So why can't you play together if you have different color skin?
Because your mom might not want you to play with that friend.
It's okay to tell people that they can't be your friend because of the color of their skin?
Mm-hmm.
Why is that okay?
Because your mom and I want them to be the same, be a different color friends.
Do you think it'd be easy for a kid to convince his parents that it would be okay to have other types of people over? Why not?
Probably because you might get in trouble.
Why would a parent want you to get in trouble if you wanted someone to come over to your house who was a different skin color?
Probably because they don't allow.
Why not? Why would some parents not allow other skin colored kids to come over?
Probably because they might not like that skin color. I've been bullied for like the way I look and the way of my skin at my previous school that I went to, and they just kept on bullying me, and I didn't like it. I just asked them to stop like over and over again, and then I tried not to break, but I couldn't hold on anymore. So I asked my mom, "Can I leave?"
My grandparents have a lot of they're very racist against African Americans and like other races, but it's 2012, so they have to like push that aside, and they'll be like, no, that's wrong to be, you want to stick with your own race, and I'm like, no, I'm friends with everyone.
We welcome you.
Okay. That's an interesting ad in the middle there, but so yeah. 2012, and it sounds like it's still today, which is, I guess, the even sadder part of that. Let's go back to the presentation. So yeah, ethnic racial socialization, there's a lot of different reasons why obviously parents go through that process with their children. And one of the big reasons is that it's still such a hugely problematic issue. You would think that this is something that we shouldn't still be talking about, but as recent events have shown us, we're still not there at all. So it's obviously a longer video. You can all go ahead and watch that. It's on Compass.
Okay. Yes, I see some stuff on blackfishing, modern day blackface, absolutely. I went to school in Spokane, where a few years ago, the head of the NAACP division there, the president, they found out was actually a white woman wearing blackface, pretending to be black. And it was a huge scandal, and was, I don't know exactly what her name was, but it was just appalling. But yeah, so one of those things. But look at these answers and these kids. Some people wondered, especially in like white children, like, okay, so I've seen other videos where white kids were asked about race and they said, no, we can't be friends. I couldn't be friends with someone of another race. And their parents say, we've never talked about race. I don't know where they're getting these. And some of the parents have tears in their eyes in some of the other videos I've seen and not understanding, like, I specifically never talk about race, so why would my kids develop these thoughts? And one of the things we talk about in the ethnic socialization is colorblindness. This idea that minimizes or ignores the existence of race or racism in contemporary society. People thought, okay, so if we really want races to be equal and equitable, we should ignore race, essentially. We should pretend this isn't a thing. But unfortunately, that it translated to, I don't see color, was the common thing people said, or like, I don't see that. But it translated to, I don't see your culture. I don't see what's unique about you and wonderful about you. And I also don't see the oppression you face. So Helen Neville, awesome professor in my department. She's one of those faculty I'm like a huge fan of. One of the things she studies is colorblind racial ideology. And she wrote this great paper in 2013, I highly recommend. But she talks about two aspects of this colorblind racial ideology. Okay, So the first emphasizes sameness, and it rejects the idea of like white racial superiority, right? So it's when people say we're all the same. It's an evasion of any physical or cultural differences between us, okay? And then the other part of it is a power evasion. So it's an evasion of power relationships. It's a covert form of racism that replaces overt forms of racism. So there's a big movement saying that these overt forms of racism have gone down, and covert forms of racism have gone up significantly. And so that's happening in this color blindness. It's how racism has adapted. This was very prominent, especially in the 90s and 2000s, still to today is a very prominent thing. And APA in 1997 investigated this and wrote an article about it saying, despite society's best attempts to ignore race, research indicates that race does matter and that race is very significant. And we're going to go over some of the findings on the next slide. Yeah, so there's been a lot of work looking at this idea of color blindness, and generally they've found that while everyone tends to, color blindness is present across races, but generally people of color are more likely to endorse multiculturalism, and white people are more likely to endorse color blindness. Unfortunately, color blindness among white individuals is linked to increased racial and gender intolerance, more racial bias on explicit and implicit measures, higher social dominance, lower cultural appreciation, fear of people of color, and lack of ethnocultural empathy. So this has been very, very well researched. And they've also found that color blindness can facilitate complicity in racial inequity. So for instance, in one study, what they did was they had kids or participants read a vignette with a white color character and who made a prejudiced comment with some ambiguity, and a black character confront that comment. And those in higher colorblind ideology were more likely to find the comment negative and less appropriate. They also find that when mothers of white children read books that have race themes, when mothers take a colorblind approach where they don't necessarily talk about race within the book, that's what generally white mothers are more likely to do. And they also looked at, in that study, children's attitudes about race and their mothers' attitudes about race. And the interesting thing they found was that children's attitude was not predicted by their mother's attitude. It was predicted by their mother's cross-race friendships, who she was friends with. And then parents who are more aware of biases are more likely to engage in color-conscious racial socialization. So parents who are more aware that biases exist are more likely to socialize their kids and let them know discrimination exists, differences exist. Yeah.
So basically a lot of what we've been talking about and the whole concept of color blindness, a lot of it comes down to what kind of role parenting plays, right, in this whole process of learning prejudice and learning social categorization and how that occurs. So there was a researcher, Dr. Allport, who did a study on this, and it was called The Nature of Prejudice. And as you can see, there's a quote from the study here, where he says that at a home that is suppressive, harsh, or critical, where the parent's word is law, it is more likely to prepare the groundwork for group prejudice. It seems very likely that rejective, neglectful, and inconsistent styles of training tend to lead to the development of prejudice. Conversely, children from more relaxed and secure homes are treated permissively and with affection, are more likely to develop tolerance. So there's a whole body of literature which talks about how parenting affects this whole process, and we talked about some of it here. And it's just important to remember that this is something that is one of probably a pretty big predictor of how prejudice occurs and how it grows for children. Now, based on that whole conversation now, we're going to look at a pretty interesting study. It's by the author was Sheriff, and it was called the Robbers Cave Experiments, right? So it's obviously pretty old. It's from 1956. And the setup was that there were a group of 11 to 12-year-old boys. They were ethnically and socioeconomically homogenous, so it was not a diverse group. There were no deviant or aggressive kids, so it was not, again, diverse in that sense either. And what happened was that this group of children was taken to a summer camp, which was run by Sheriff and his colleagues. Now, when the children reached the camp, they were put together in bunkhouses, they made friends with each other, and that's how they spent the first few days. But at some point then they were divided into groups so that they were no longer with their friends. They and their friends were maybe in different groups. And then the researchers observed them over a period of time to see what happened. And there were certain different activities that they were made to do. And they wanted to see what happened, particularly in the sense of group conflict and harmony. So they wanted to see what happened when they were pursuing certain conflicting aims versus when they were pursuing certain superordinate common goals. There was a common goal that they were all trying to achieve. So what happened was in the beginning, so the groups that were formed were, one of them was called the Red Devils and the other one was called the Bulldogs. And in these, in the graphs here, as you can see, right in the beginning, in the early days, when they were just coming in, the group sort of, so the white one is the Red Devils and the black bar there is for the Bulldogs. And in the early days, the sort of friendship choices and all of that was, the percentage of friendships were pretty low. And then by the fifth day, the rate at which everybody was making friends with each other had gone up significantly, right? And there was obviously a sort of horizontal structure to begin with. So there were different group chores that people were doing. Somebody was cooking, there were athletes, there were troublemakers, there were geeks, so that kind of very similar to the sort of groups that Bethany talked about in high school. So there's, you know, the jocks and the nerds, etc., etc. In the same way, there were these groups here as well. And there was the vertical structure, right? There was a hierarchy. So there were group leaders, there was a social status, which was linked to different kids. And based on that, the sort of group dynamic was based on that. There was also different group cultures, right? So there were like inside jokes for each of the groups. They gave nicknames to each other. They had this certain group spirit that was happening. And it was just all the different things, all the different sort of elements that you would expect of when people are put into these groups or made to have this sort of sense of community with another set of people. These are, so they did certain sociometric tests, and these were the sort of results from that. And we can see that there's a sort of egalitarian versus a hierarchical structure here, because as you can see for the Bulldogs, there were a lot more, there was a much better mix of children who were chosen as friends by somebody else. So the whole process of the sociometric test is that you choose other other people that you like or are friends with or want to be friends with. And so the dotted lines there are for one-way choices, which means that one kid chose another kid as somebody they liked or wanted to be friends with, but that other kid didn't choose them in return. The solid lines are for children who chose each other as their preferred friend or somebody they wanted to be friends with. So for the Bulldogs, as you can see, there's a fairly good mix of children who chose each other as wanting to be friends with each other. There is also, of course, a lot of people who had one-way choices. So they chose some people who they wanted to be friends with, and based on that, they rate popularity, right? And so that's what the scale is on the side there. It's a popularity scale. For the Bulldogs, again, yes, so it's a lot more sort of egalitarian. But then for the Red Devils, as you can see, it's very, very hierarchical. There are these two kids right on the top there, L and S, and pretty much almost every other kid in that group wanted to be friends with them. They're pretty much almost all of them are one-sided, particularly for L, all of them are one-sided. And for S, there's a few which are the solid lines, which meant that they reciprocated the friendship, particularly with M and B. But then for everyone else, it's again one-sided. So it's very hierarchical. Some kids have a lot of popularity in this group, while others don't as much. So given this situation.
Sinchari, can you go back for a second?
Sure. Yep, you're welcome. Alrighty. So this is what the sort of, like an underlying situation was like, what the groups were like. And based on that, this is what happened. So the study was, they kind of had all these different sorts of activities happening. The first kind of activity that was there was about group conflict, right? So there were different competitions, there were these camp games. So they had baseball, tug of war, all the sort of summer camp games, which I've only seen in movies because we don't have summer camps in India. But then based on that, those kind of games were done in the study, and they all caused a lot of friction, right? The researchers saw that the games started off okay, and they started off with, I guess, some sort of sportsmanship, but then the hostility and the violence grew very quickly. There were these kind of different ways in which the children just ended up making it into more of a conflict rather than just a game, right? There were also transitions in group structure and measurement. So one of the groups apparently had a bit of a coup and they disposed of their leader. One of the bullies in that group actually became their leader, and it led to an increase in the solidarity within the group. We can see that in certain situations as well, where somebody who is technically, not the nicest of people, but they have a very, very strong identification with their group, whatever that might be, that community. When they become leaders, solidarity sometimes increases because they have such strong ideas of their own identity with the group that that other people within the group also feel that same sort of solidarity, right? And it doesn't matter who that leader is, it's more about how they identify with that group. Oops. There were also, different sort of things. It was not just in the, games or sports that kind of conflict happened. The conflict was also happening within the dining hall, where technically there didn't need to be any sort of differentiation between what group you were in. But, when they were making a line to go and get the food, depending on who got to the head of the line, it always became a contest, right? The kids who did not win the, head of the line position would say ladies first at the winner, all of that stuff. They would throw stuff at each other while they were at the tables. I think Eagle and Rattlers were also a different kind of group that they looked at. And so, it was just a very not harmonious situation that was happening at this camp. So there was a lot of intergroup conflict that kept happening within the experiment. And so the question is, the reason why we're looking at this study is that how do you really then bring these groups into harmony, right? Because there were social events, right? So the camp games, even the eating together in the hall at night, these are all kind of social events. And these, you would think, would bring these two groups into contact and kind of bring about some sort of harmony. Like, why should there still be conflict when everybody is doing the same thing here? And that is part of what the contact hypothesis was by Allport. And as you can see in these charts here, these were the measurements of negative ratings by the two different groups during certain activities. Okay, so we talked about the activities where there was group conflict, but then there were also activities where they tried to bring about harmony. And now, so those activities were something like introducing some sort of crisis. At one point, they said that there was a water shortage and everybody had to work together to, I think, reroute a water line from somewhere or get water from a river nearby and get that to the camp. And everybody had to work together. It didn't matter what group you were in. If you didn't work together, there was not going to be any water. So there was one like that. Then there was something about a truck breaking down. So again, everybody had to work together towards this common goal of somehow making the truck work again so that they could get to another place, or having a movie night where, again, everybody was watching the same thing, something happened to the projector, they had to, again, work together to solve the issue. And so they found, as you can see, that in the situations where the conflict was happening, so the games or the dining hall situation, negative ratings for both of the groups were pretty high. Both groups had pretty negative feelings towards the other group. But then in the situations where they had to work together and kind of come together in some sort of a harmonious kind of way, negative ratings fell down very, very significantly. And this kind of gives us the idea of that it's a very, very possible thing that just social contact is not enough to bring about harmony between two different communities or two different groups. It's when it is guided by a common goal, and that is when this conflict can be resolved. If you are trying to look at just having games or something like that, you're still sort of pitting two groups against one another, and so it might not lead to harmony as such. It might be a start, which is why sports have always been seen as a really good way of, there's friendly matches, things like that, and sports has always been seen as a way of bringing people together. But then this study kind of showed that when there's a common goal that everybody's working towards, that's when intergroup conflict will reduce the most. So again, I'm gonna look at the chat. Yes, so as Jacob said, social events require voluntary approach. Crisis throws you together. You don't have any option there and forces harmony. I agree. So that's what this whole Robbers Cave experiment was all about. We do have to keep in mind that it is a more experimental setting. As I said, it was only done with boys. It was not a diverse group at all. So we have to keep these things in mind, but the fact of the matter is that even given all of those facts, when you give an activity which has a common goal in mind, you're probably going to get more harmony than if you don't. So based on that, like part of that, we've read so much now about ethnic racial identity and how being part of a group, how that affects different things, right? And so I'm like bringing up some research by my advisor, Nidia Ruedas Gracia, and she's been doing a lot of work with this topic and cultural mismatch and also sense of belonging, which is really cool, but we're not talking about today. She saw that she looked at first generation low income college students, and she saw that there's a strong sense of cultural mismatch between these students' culture of origin and the university culture once they come into college. And culture of origin just means their home culture or where they're originally coming in from. So she found that when she, surveyed these college students, these low-income first-generation students felt there was a mismatch between the culture that they were used to when they were at home versus the culture that then they were thrown into once they joined a college and they came into the university campus. If the two cultures are somewhat compatible, it can lead to positive outcomes, right? So you can feel more creative because you're suddenly, you're able to pull from two different pools of knowledge now. You can feel more creative because of that. You'll have higher self-esteem because you feel more at home in two different settings. There's more pro-social behavior and certain other positive outcomes as well. And so, and this is if you find your two cultures to be compatible. If you find them to be conflicting, these positive outcomes didn't show up for those students. And the main point here was that with these students who did have this sort of mismatch, or the sort of, they found this difference between their culture of origin and university culture, they found that the strong sense of ethnic racial identity actually could be a protective factor against the negative outcomes of this mismatch. So for students who had conflicting cultures, if they had a strong sense of ethnic racial identity as well, it helped them sort of, it helped mitigate the negative effects or the negative outcomes this mismatch might have, because for a lot of people, coming into the new sort of setting of college could be very, very difficult to navigate. It can be very difficult to get used to. And it's something that you have to sort of work through so that you can work on everything else, because you're not just coming into college, you're doing a lot of other things with it. But the point is that ethnic racial identity in certain contexts can be very, very helpful and very, very sort of almost essential in some cases for students or just individuals to achieve their full potentials. So, okay, so that's all we have here. Questions? Okay, so what we're gonna do is the activity that we have for today is, I'm gonna stop sharing first. So the activity that we're gonna be doing today is on certain questions, and I don't know how many of you know about, there's a YouTube channel and they're a company as well called Skin Deep, or the AND Project. Now, they have these really cool sort of card decks, and they're all with questions that you can ask each other and have conversations over. So what I have done is I borrowed the deck from one of my friends, and Bethany and I kind of chose a few cards which we thought would bring up good discussions. There's, I think, 12 cards. You have to choose just 3 questions out of those and have a conversation with your group about them. I just put it in the chat and it is loading, but so that's your activity. And yeah, there's a space for you to submit this on Compass once you're done.
I have a quick question.
Yep, go ahead.
Can we go over color blindness socialization one more time, because I'm having like trouble understanding what it means.
Sure.
Sorry, my video totally cut out. What was there a question or just reviewing the slide?
Yeah, can you just like review the slide, like just in general, what it means?
Yeah, this slide or the previous one?
Color blindness socialization, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically this is just looking at socialization, and I was summarizing a few studies looking at this, but the main points when we study color blindness socialization of children, we find that in general, white parents are more likely to adopt a colorblind approach to socialization, and families of color are more likely to adopt a multicultural approach. to socialization, that colorblindness can facilitate complicity and racial inequality. There's a lot of different studies looking at, we're going to give kids a story about multiculturalism and colorblindness. And they found that afterward, the kids who read the colorblind story were less likely to intervene in a situation of racial inequality. So they had kids read these books. The ones who read the colorblind book, less likely to be in that situation. And then generally, when we see that parents are more aware of biases in our society, they're more likely to engage in color conscious racial socialization. So they're less likely to take the colorblind approach. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. Bethany, I think you're gonna have to make the groups. It's not giving me the option for that.
Okay.
And then after that, you're done. That's all. Just make sure you submit your handout.
Yep. And we'll be synchronous next week. We'll be in person doing identity development.